Imagine being hunted by something that craves your flesh, lurking in the darkest corners of the forest, waiting for you to make a single mistake. Welcome to the terrifying world of the Wendigo, a creature from Algonquian folklore that feeds on fear and flesh. In the stories you're about to witness, we explore spine-chilling encounters with this monstrous being, half human, half beast, possessing those who dare to enter its territory. The Wendigo haunts the cold forests of the northern Atlantic coast and Great Lakes, where survival is a cruel game and no one leaves unscathed. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain? Share your story with us in the comments. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. You might not be alone. We want to know if you're brave enough to face the horrors that lie ahead. Buckle up for a nightmarish journey into darkness. These stories will keep you on edge until the very end, if you can handle it. Chased by a creature in the forest. Nathan had always felt at home in the vast wilderness of Minnesota's national parks. As a park ranger, his days were spent patrolling trails, guiding campers, and ensuring the safety of the park's visitors. But recently, something about the woods had changed. The air had grown heavier, the usual sounds of wildlife had fallen eerily silent, and there were moments where he felt as though the trees themselves were watching him. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace, it was the kind that pressed down on him, as though the forest was holding its breath. It started with small things. Reports from campers about strange noises in the night, footsteps too heavy to belong to any animal in the area, and shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long at dusk. Nathan dismissed them at first. The woods could play tricks on tired eyes, and campers often let their imaginations run wild after a few days in the wilderness. But as the weeks passed, the reports became harder to ignore. One evening, as he made his rounds near one of the more remote campsites, Nathan felt it again, that oppressive silence. The wind had died down, and not a single bird or insect made a sound. He stood still, scanning the tree-line, his hand resting instinctively on his radio. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, something tall and thin, just at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. The figure stood unnaturally still, too tall to be human and too thin to be any animal he knew. Its limbs seemed elongated, and its skin appeared ashen in the fading light. Nathan blinked, and in that moment, it was gone, vanished into the trees without a sound. His pulse quickened, and though he tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, the sightings increased. Campers reported seeing the same figure near their campsites, standing just outside the glow of their campfires, watching. When they tried to approach, it would retreat into the woods, moving with an unnatural fluidity that sent shivers down their spines. Nathan confided in an older ranger named Bill, someone who had worked in the park for decades. Bill listened quietly as Nathan described the figure, the silence, and the unease that had taken hold of the forest. When Nathan finished, Bill's face was grim. He leaned in and, in a low voice, spoke of an old legend, one that had been passed down by the indigenous people of the region. The Wendigo, Bill said, was a spirit of the forest, a malevolent force that preyed on those lost in the wilderness. It could appear as a monstrous creature or possess the body of a human, twisting them into something barely recognizable. The legend spoke of hunger, of desperation, and of a being that craved flesh. Nathan had heard the stories before, but they had always seemed like just that, stories. Now, as the sun set over the forest, casting long shadows across the trees, Nathan wasn't so sure. After his conversation with Bill, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than he'd imagined was lurking in the woods. Every evening, as he made his rounds through the park, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, scanning the tree-line for any sign of the creature. The reports from campers continued, each one more unsettling than the last. Some claimed to hear distant voices calling their names in the night, while others spoke of waking to find their campsite surrounded by strange, twisted tracks. Nathan tried to keep his nerves in check, but the sense of unease grew with each passing day. The forest felt different, like it was holding a secret too terrible to reveal. And every time he stepped into the woods, it felt like he was being watched, followed by something he couldn't see. One night, as he patrolled a particularly remote section of the park, the oppressive silence returned. Nathan's breath hitched as the wind died down, leaving nothing but the faint rustle of the trees. His radio crackled with static, cutting out completely. He stood still, his eyes scanning the shadowed forest, but saw nothing. The shadows stretched out in front of him, long and unnerving in the fading light. That's when he saw it again. The same figure from before, tall, thin, and distorted, stood at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Nathan's heart raced as he stared, frozen in place. The creature didn't move, but its presence filled the air with an unnatural tension, as though the forest itself was recoiling from it. The silence was deafening, and the temperature seemed to drop around him. Suddenly, the figure shifted. It moved in a way that wasn't natural, its limbs bending in ways no human or animal could. Nathan stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees as he tried to focus on the creature. But before he could take another step, it disappeared, vanishing into the shadows like it had never been there. Nathan's radio crackled back to life, but the sound startled him. He grabbed it, his voice shaking as he called out to Bill. There was no answer, only more static. Panic gripped him as he realized how isolated he was. The nearest campsite was miles away, and the dark woods stretched endlessly around him. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the silent forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The figure was gone, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. When he finally reached his truck, he slammed the door shut, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The night pressed in around him, but the creature's image remained burned into his mind. It was real, and whatever it was getting closer. The next morning, Nathan sat at the ranger station, his mind still reeling from the previous night's encounter. He couldn't shake the image of the creature, its distorted form, the unnatural way it moved. The forest had always been a place of peace for him, but now it felt like a trap. The woods were hiding something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Bill entered the station and immediately noticed the tension in Nathan's posture. Nathan recounted the events from the night before, his voice trembling slightly as he described the figure, its glowing eyes, and the eerie silence that had surrounded him. Bill listened quietly, his expression growing darker with every word. When Nathan finished, Bill leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. He explained that the sightings weren't new, there had been whispers among the rangers for years, stories passed down from one generation to the next. Most dismissed them as folklore, but Bill had always believed there was truth to them. He spoke of the Wendigo, a creature from ancient Algonquian legend, a being that once was human but had been twisted into something monstrous, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Bill's words sent chills down Nathan's spine. The Wendigo wasn't just a story, it was real. And now, it was hunting in the very forest Nathan had called home for years. As the day wore on, Nathan's fear deepened. The forest felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that he had never noticed before. Every rustle of the leaves, every shadow that flickered in his peripheral vision, set him on edge. He couldn't escape the feeling that the creature was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, Nathan decided to stay at the station overnight, too uneasy to return to his usual patrol. As night fell, the familiar silence settled over the woods, but this time, it felt different, heavier, darker, as though the forest was holding its breath. Nathan paced the room, checking his radio every few minutes, but the crackling static offered no comfort. Around midnight, the air grew colder. Nathan felt a chill crawl up his spine as the wind outside the station began to howl. The trees outside swayed violently, casting twisted shadows through the windows. He peered out into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, he saw it. Standing just beyond the tree-line, barely visible in the moonlight, was the figure, tall, thin, and hunched over. Its glowing eyes locked onto Nathan's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The creature didn't move, but its presence filled the air with a suffocating dread. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as the creature took a single step forward, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. He grabbed his flashlight and ran outside, his mind screaming for him to retreat, but his body driven by some desperate need to confront the creature. The Wendigo stood still, watching as Nathan approached, its eyes never leaving his. The silence around them was absolute, as though the world itself had stopped. And then, with a guttural growl that echoed through the trees, the creature lunged. Nathan barely had time to react as the creature lunged at him, its movements impossibly fast and feral. He stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight in the process, plunging the world around him into near darkness. The only light came from the creature's glowing eyes, which seemed to burn with an insatiable hunger. The cold night air wrapped around him, thick with the stench of decay and something far worse. Scrambling to his feet, Nathan sprinted back toward the ranger station, his heart pounding in his ears. The creature followed, its distorted limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved, covering the ground with terrifying speed. Every fiber of Nathan's being screamed for him to run faster, but he could feel the Wendigo closing in. The sound of its ragged breath and guttural growls sent a surge of panic through him. As Nathan reached the door of the station, he threw it open and slammed it shut behind him. The creature slammed into the door with a force that rattled the entire structure. The wood groaned under the pressure, but it held. Nathan backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the creature scratched at the door, its claws scraping against the wood with an ear-splitting screech. The Wendigo's low growl reverberated through the walls, and for a moment, Nathan thought the door would give way. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan stood frozen, too afraid to move, his eyes locked on the door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Slowly, Nathan approached the window, peering out into the darkness. The creature was gone, the forest once again shrouded in an unnatural calm. But the dread lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the Wendigo was still watching, waiting for its next opportunity. Nathan collapsed into a chair, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He had survived, but he knew deep down that the creature wasn't gone. It had retreated into the shadows, but it would return, of that, he was certain. The Wendigo was patient, a predator that thrived on fear, and Nathan had felt its hunger. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the forest, Nathan knew he couldn't stay. The park, once his sanctuary, had become a place of nightmares. The Wendigo was real, and it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into its territory. Packing his belongings, Nathan left the ranger station, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no one would believe him. The legend of the Wendigo would remain a story, passed down through generations, a tale to scare children around campfires. But Nathan knew the truth. The Wendigo was real, and it was still hungry. Winged beast attacks biker. It was well past midnight when John McAllister, a seasoned motorcyclist, began the long ride home through the rural backroads of northern Michigan. The winding roads were familiar to him, but they always carried an eerie stillness late at night. The only sounds were the rumble of his engine and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. The sky was clouded, and the moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of branches above. John had ridden this road countless times before, but something felt different tonight. There was an unsettling quiet that clung to the air, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting. He shook off the feeling, tightening his grip on the handlebars and increasing his speed slightly to make it home faster. The sooner he got out of the woods, the better. As he rounded a sharp bend, the headlights of his bike illuminated something in the road ahead. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree branch, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't something ordinary. A large, dark figure loomed just beyond the edge of the road, hunched and motionless. It was too large to be a deer or any animal he knew of. John's heart raced as he slowed his bike, squinting into the darkness. The figure moved. In one swift motion, it unfurled massive wings that cast a shadow across the road, and with a loud, piercing screech, it shot toward him. John barely had time to react. The creature slammed into him with such force that he was thrown from his bike. He hit the ground hard, his helmet saving him from the worst of the impact, but the force left him dazed. Lying on the cold asphalt, John struggled to regain his bearings. The bike's engine had stalled, and in the sudden silence, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing. His vision blurred as he looked up, catching a glimpse of the creature that had knocked him down. It stood tall, as big as a man, but with bird-like features, long, dark feathers, and what looked like a hand at the end of one wing. John scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. This thing wasn't supposed to exist. He'd heard stories about strange creatures in the woods, but nothing like this. The creature moved toward him, its beady eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It cocked its head to the side, watching him with an almost predatory curiosity. Without thinking, John ran. His bike was useless, and there was no way he could fight off whatever this was. The woods seemed to close in around him as he sprinted down the road, the creature's heavy wings flapping behind him. He could feel it closing in, the rush of air from its wings nearly knocking him off balance again. Just as John thought he wouldn't make it, the creature let out another deafening screech and disappeared into the night sky, leaving him alone in the darkness. His legs gave out, and he collapsed by the side of the road, heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped, but the encounter had left him shaken to his core. John sat on the side of the road, gasping for air, his body trembling from the adrenaline that surged through his veins. The dark, eerie silence of the forest returned, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. His heart was still racing, and his mind struggled to process what had just happened. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving him in the suffocating stillness of the woods. His motorcycle lay a few feet away, its front light flickering weakly. The damage seemed minimal, but John was in no condition to check. He ran his hands through his hair, his body shaking with shock. What the hell was that thing? He had seen strange animals in his life, but nothing even came close to what had just attacked him. A bird-like creature as large as a person, with hand-like appendages? It sounded like something out of a nightmare. John's mind raced with questions, but the one thought that kept replaying in his head was that he had been lucky to escape. The creature could have easily killed him, yet it didn't. It had attacked, knocked him off his bike, and then left. The memory of its glowing eyes and screech haunted him as he forced himself to stand. Using what little energy he had left, John stumbled over to his motorcycle, his legs shaky from the encounter. He lifted the bike upright and checked for serious damage. The engine sputtered to life when he turned the key, and he breathed a sigh of relief. At least the bike still worked, but he wasn't about to linger here any longer than necessary. As he climbed back on the bike, a wave of paranoia washed over him. He scanned the treetops and the road ahead, expecting to see the creature again, waiting to strike. But the road was empty, and the shadows of the trees loomed over him like silent sentinels. The sense of being watched clung to him, though, an invisible presence that refused to let him feel safe. John sped down the road, his eyes darting from side to side, the tension in his body never easing. Every rustle of the leaves, every shadow that moved in the corner of his vision, made his heart pound. The ride home felt like an eternity, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him, making every mile seem endless. When he finally reached his house on the outskirts of town, John parked the bike in the driveway, his hands still shaking. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had followed him, that it was lurking in the darkness just beyond the reach of his headlights. He hurried inside, locking the door behind him. Inside the safety of his home, the silence felt heavier than ever. The walls seemed to close in on him, and every creak of the house made his pulse quicken. John knew he couldn't ignore what had happened, but at the same time, he couldn't explain it. He had come face to face with something unnatural, something terrifying, and now, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Days passed, but John couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over him since the encounter. Every night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of the creature's glowing eyes and the unnatural sound of its wings cutting through the air. His once peaceful home, nestled in the rural outskirts of town, now felt like a prison. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. John had told no one about what had happened. Who would believe him? A giant bird-like creature with hands? It sounded absurd, like something out of a horror movie or a twisted folktale. But he had seen it, felt its presence, and that alone was enough to keep him on edge. The silence that had settled over his house was unnerving. Every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind against the windows, set his nerves on fire. The nights felt longer now, stretched out into an endless cycle of paranoia and fear. And no matter how hard he tried to forget, the image of the creature haunted him. It wasn't long before strange things began happening around his property. At first, it was subtle, a soft tapping on the windows late at night, like the sound of claws scraping against the glass. Then, he noticed scratches on the walls outside, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by something sharp, something large. John's paranoia grew with each passing day. Every time he stepped outside, he felt like he was being watched, as if the creature had followed him home and was now lurking somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. The once peaceful woods around his house now felt ominous, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. One night, unable to sleep, John stepped outside onto his porch. The cold night air hit him, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing mind. But as he stood there, staring out into the woods, a familiar feeling crept over him, the same oppressive silence that had blanketed the road that night. His heart began to race, and he scanned the treeline, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the dark outline of the trees against the night sky. But then, in the distance, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of wings, heavy and slow, cutting through the air. John's blood ran cold. He stood frozen on the porch, his eyes locked on the treeline. And then he saw it. The creature, perched on a branch not far from his house, its glowing eyes fixed on him. It was as large and menacing as he remembered, its wings stretched out wide, casting long shadows across the ground. The hand-like appendage at the end of its wing flexed slowly, as though it was preparing to strike. John's heart pounded in his chest as he backed toward the door. The creature watched him, unmoving, as if waiting for him to make the first move. But John knew one thing, it hadn't come to watch this time. John stood frozen on the porch, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature's glowing eyes were locked on him, unblinking, as it perched high in the trees like a predator stalking its prey. The silence around him was suffocating, and the cold night air felt even heavier as he realized that this time, the creature wasn't here to scare him, it was here for something far worse. For a moment, neither of them moved. John's eyes flickered toward the door, but he knew he wouldn't make it inside fast enough. The creature was too large, too fast, and he was too far from any help. His only option was to face it head-on, to survive whatever this thing was planning. Suddenly, with a loud screech that pierced the air, the creature launched itself from the tree. Its wings spread wide, casting monstrous shadows across the ground as it swooped toward John. He ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as its massive form passed overhead. He bolted for the door, but before he could reach it, the creature landed behind him, its claws digging into the wooden porch with a sickening crack. John spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature loomed over him, its body twisting unnaturally, those hand-like appendages flexing in the dim light. It screeched again, louder this time, a sound that echoed deep into the woods, as if calling out to the darkness itself. With nowhere to run, John grabbed the only weapon he could find, a rusted metal pole that leaned against the side of the house. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He held it tightly, his hands shaking as he prepared for the creature to strike again. The creature lunged, its talons swiping at John with terrifying speed. He swung the pole wildly, barely managing to deflect the blow. The creature shrieked in anger, recoiling for a brief moment, giving John just enough time to scramble toward the edge of the porch. His body screamed with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not now. He swung the pole again, catching the creature across its chest. It stumbled backward, its wings flaring out as it let out another piercing cry. But this time, instead of attacking, the creature hesitated. Its glowing eyes seemed to study him, as if calculating its next move. John's breath was ragged, his vision blurring with fear and fatigue. The creature took a step back, its wings twitching, and for a brief moment, it seemed to reconsider. Then, with a final, bone-chilling screech, it took off into the night sky, disappearing into the darkness. John collapsed onto the porch, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had survived, but the encounter had left him shaken to his core. The creature was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet countryside, John knew that his life would never be the same. The creature, with its unnatural wings and glowing eyes, had left a mark on him, one that he couldn't escape. It was out there, in the shadows, watching. Waiting. Haunted by a silent watcher. It was late, far later than anyone should have been hanging around the old church. The clock had just struck midnight, and the small group of friends, Sam, Mark, Lisa, and Jenna, had gathered in the church's parking lot to talk. The night was cool, and the only sound was the distant hum of crickets. The church itself stood tall and ominous, its towering spire reaching into the starless sky, casting long shadows over the group. The place had always given them an uneasy feeling, but it was a convenient spot to meet up. As they stood around, laughing and chatting, Sam's attention drifted toward the church windows. His laughter abruptly stopped, a chill running down his spine. Inside the darkened building, barely visible through the dim light, stood a figure. A man, pale and thin, dressed in old-fashioned Sunday clothes, was staring at them from behind the stained glass. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold and unblinking. Sam nudged Mark, pointing toward the window. One by one, they all turned to see the man standing there. An eerie silence fell over the group. The man didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, staring out at them. It wasn't just his sudden appearance that unsettled them, it was the absolute stillness, like he wasn't even alive. The group exchanged uneasy glances, each feeling the growing tension. They knew the church was supposed to be locked at night. No one should have been inside, especially after midnight. The parking lot, which had seemed harmless moments ago, now felt oppressive, as though the darkness itself was watching them. Mark tried to dismiss it, but even his voice lacked its usual confidence. Deep down, they all sensed something wasn't right. Lisa's breath quickened, and she muttered that they should leave. The figure inside the church didn't move, didn't acknowledge them in any way. He just stood there, pale and unmoving, as though he were a part of the church itself. Sam's pulse raced as a deep sense of dread washed over him. The man didn't look human, he felt wrong, unnatural, like a shadow of something long dead. Without another word, they rushed to their cars, the sense of urgency rising with every step. Jenna fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking, while Mark quickly backed his car out of the lot. As they sped away from the church, the figure remained in the window, watching them disappear into the night. But the terror wasn't over yet. Halfway home, Sam's heart sank. He had left his car keys back at the church. He pulled over, anxiety gripping him as he explained that he had to go back. Mark, hesitant but concerned, agreed to return with him. As they turned the car around, the weight of dread pressed down on them. The church, and its silent watcher, waited in the shadows. The drive back to the church was eerily quiet. Sam and Mark barely spoke, the weight of what they had seen pressing heavily on their minds. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, but the familiar road now seemed foreign, as though they were venturing into something far more sinister. Sam couldn't shake the image of the pale man from his mind, his cold, unblinking eyes fixed on them from the church window. As they approached the church, the building loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette even more imposing in the dead of night. The parking lot was empty, just as they had left it, but the eerie stillness made Sam's stomach churn. He could feel the weight of the dark church pressing down on them, like it was waiting for their return. Mark parked the car near the entrance, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The church stood silent, its windows dark and empty. The figure, the pale man who had watched them so intently, was nowhere to be seen. Sam hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. He didn't want to go back inside, but he needed those keys. They both stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. Sam felt an overwhelming sense of dread as they approached the steps leading to the church's entrance. The building towered over them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward them like grasping hands. Sam led the way to where they had stood earlier, near the spot where he had last seen the figure. His breath was shallow, every step feeling like it dragged him deeper into something dark and unknown. The closer they got to the church, the louder the silence became, as though the very air was holding its breath. When they reached the place where he had dropped his keys, Sam froze. His keys were lying there, exactly where he had left them. Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing fear. Something was off, he could feel it. Mark stood behind him, scanning the darkened windows of the church, his eyes darting back and forth. The unease was palpable. The building had an energy now, a presence that seemed to pulse through the ground beneath their feet. Sam bent down to pick up his keys, his hand shaking. As his fingers wrapped around the cold metal, he heard it, a faint noise, like a whisper carried on the wind. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from inside the church. He stood up slowly, his eyes locking onto the nearest window. The pale man was still gone, but the darkness beyond the glass seemed deeper, more alive. The whispering continued, growing louder now, though neither of them could make out what it was saying. Mark grabbed Sam's arm, his voice barely above a whisper as he urged him to leave. They didn't need any more convincing. They rushed back to the car, their footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. As they sped away, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that the figure hadn't just disappeared, it had been watching, waiting for them to return. The drive home felt suffocating. The darkness outside the car windows seemed to stretch endlessly, a void that threatened to swallow them whole. Sam gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he sped down the empty roads. Mark sat in the passenger seat, silent, but his eyes never stopped darting to the rearview mirror, as though expecting the pale figure to reappear at any moment. Neither of them spoke. The whispering that had echoed from the church still lingered in their minds, an ominous reminder that they had left something behind in that building, something unseen and far more sinister than they could comprehend. As they reached Sam's house, the tension between them hung thick in the air. The safety of home should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a temporary shield from whatever haunted the church. Sam parked the car and sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing. There was no logical explanation for what they had experienced. The church was supposed to be locked. No one should have been inside, and yet, they had seen him, the pale man, the watcher. Mark finally broke the silence. His voice was low, barely audible, as he suggested they tell the others. They couldn't be the only ones to know about this. But Sam hesitated. Who would believe them? A figure staring out from inside a locked church? Whispering in the dark? It sounded ridiculous. Still, the fear gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. Something had happened that night, something beyond their understanding. They couldn't just forget it. The next day, Sam and Mark met up with Lisa and Jenna to recount what had happened after they left. The four friends sat together in a coffee shop, but the usually bright, casual atmosphere felt dim, overshadowed by the lingering unease. As Sam and Mark explained the return to the church, the strange whispers, and the figure that had disappeared without a trace, the air grew heavy with tension. Jenna, always the curious one, asked the question they had all been thinking. What had they really seen that night? Was it a ghost, a spirit, or something far worse? The local legend of the Wendigo had been whispered about for years in their small town, a malevolent creature, twisted by hunger, capable of luring people into dark, isolated places. Could it have been connected to what they saw? Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The conversation felt wrong, like they were digging too deep into something that shouldn't be disturbed. She suggested they drop it, forget what happened, and move on. But Sam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even now, as they sat in the bright daylight. As they discussed their options, Mark revealed something that made everyone's blood run cold. He had spoken to a local security guard who worked near the church, and according to him, no one had entered or exited the building after midnight. The church's security system was active, and there were no alarms or signs of a break-in. The man they had seen inside shouldn't have been there. A deep silence settled over the group. If no one had entered the church, then what? No, who had they seen? The revelation that no one had entered or exited the church after midnight sent chills through the group. The pale man they had seen, the figure watching them from the darkened window, couldn't have been there, or at least, no one who should have been there. But Sam and the others knew what they saw. The security system's report only deepened the mystery and made them question everything. As the group parted ways that afternoon, Sam felt the weight of unease settle even deeper. That night, as he lay in bed, the memories of the church flooded back. The stillness of the man, the cold, empty stare, and the whispers, they all seemed to swirl around him, keeping him wide awake. Sam's phone buzzed in the darkness. It was a message from Mark, short but unsettling. "Can't sleep. I keep thinking about the figure. What if it's still there?" Sam stared at the message, the question gnawing at him. What if the figure was still watching, waiting for them? He didn't reply. The thought was too terrifying to acknowledge. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but the night stretched on, filled with restless thoughts and the feeling that something was wrong. 2 days passed, and the group tried to move on, but the incident at the church refused to leave their minds. It was Jenna who suggested they return one last time, just to see. Maybe there was something they had missed, some explanation that would finally put their minds at ease. Sam was hesitant, but the pull of curiosity and fear was too strong to ignore. They arrived at the church just before sunset, the sky turning a dull gray as the last rays of light faded behind the building. The church loomed over them, dark and silent, just as it had that night. The parking lot was empty, and the sense of foreboding returned the moment they stepped out of the car. The church, with its tall spire and empty windows, felt like it was watching them. Together, they walked up to the doors, their hearts pounding in unison. Sam reached out, testing the handle. Locked. Of course. The same oppressive silence that had surrounded them before was back, and it clung to the air like a heavy fog. As they stood there, looking up at the church, something caught Sam's eye. There, in the farthest window, was a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was the man or just his imagination playing tricks on him, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. Without warning, Jenna gasped, pointing to the same window. She saw it too. The figure was back, pale and still, watching from the shadows. The others turned, their faces pale with fear, as the figure moved ever so slightly, its eyes locked on them. Panic took over. They scrambled back to the car, their footsteps echoing loudly in the empty lot. As they drove away, Sam glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the window, watching as they disappeared into the distance. They never returned to the church after that night, and the figure was never seen again. But the memory of the pale man, the watcher in the church, would haunt them forever. Something unnatural had lingered in that place, something they would never truly understand. Night of Fear, Wendigo strikes. The forest surrounding the Great Lakes was vast, stretching out in every direction like an endless sea of trees. For seasoned campers like Jake and his 5 friends, it was the perfect getaway from their busy lives. They had spent the last 3 days hiking, laughing, and sharing stories around the campfire. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature had always brought them peace. But on that final night, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension that none of them could explain. Jake lay in his tent, the fabric barely blocking out the cold night. His friends, all gathered in their own tents nearby, had already fallen asleep, their breathing soft and rhythmic. But Jake couldn't sleep. Something felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made him uneasy. He turned over, trying to shake the feeling, but the unease only grew. It started as a low vibration, barely noticeable at first. But as Jake lay still, he realized it was more than just the wind or distant wildlife. It felt like footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too large to belong to any animal he had ever encountered in these woods. The ground beneath him trembled ever so slightly with each step. His pulse quickened. He listened, straining his ears against the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake's instincts kicked in. He threw off his sleeping bag and scrambled out of the tent, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air hit him like a wall, but the fear that gripped him was far colder. In the dim light of the campfire, Jake could make out a massive figure moving through the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace that sent a chill down Jake's spine. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. He knew, deep down, that this was something far worse. Jake rushed to his friends' tents, his voice shaking as he called out to them, urging them to wake up. One by one, they stumbled out of their tents, groggy and confused, but the terror in Jake's voice was enough to shake them from their daze. They gathered around the dying campfire, their eyes wide with fear as they too saw the creature moving closer. It towered over the trees, its massive frame casting long shadows in the flickering light. None of them could move, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what they were witnessing. Jake's mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The stories they had heard, the legends of the Wendigo, he had always thought they were just that, legends. But now, standing face to face with this monstrous figure, he realized how wrong he had been. The creature stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on them. For a moment, everything was still. The forest around them had gone silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. And then, with a sudden, unnatural speed, the creature lunged forward. Chaos erupted as the creature lunged toward the group. Jake's heart raced, and the sound of his friends' panicked voices filled the air. There was no time to think, only to act. He grabbed the nearest backpack and shouted for everyone to run. The campsite that had been their sanctuary now felt like a trap, the towering trees closing in around them as they fled into the forest. Branches snapped underfoot, and the glow of their headlamps flickered wildly as they stumbled through the dark. The creature moved behind them, its massive form crashing through the trees with terrifying speed. Jake could hear its footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. The Wendigo was hunting them. Jake's legs burned as he ran, his mind screaming in panic. He risked a glance over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of the creature's glowing eyes, the predatory hunger in its gaze unmistakable. It was gaining on them, faster than he could have imagined. Every instinct told him to keep moving, but the weight of dread pressed down on him, making every step feel heavier. Mark, who had been running just ahead of Jake, suddenly tripped, crashing to the ground with a startled cry. Jake skidded to a halt, turning back to help his friend. But as he reached out, he saw the creature close the distance in an instant. Its long, skeletal hand swiped through the air, and Mark was gone, pulled into the shadows before Jake could even process what had happened. A scream tore through Jake's throat, but he kept running. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. Mark was gone. Taken by the Wendigo. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, but there was no time to mourn. If he stopped now, he would be next. The group was scattered, each friend running in different directions, desperate to escape the creature's reach. Jake could hear them shouting for each other, their voices echoing through the trees, but the forest seemed to swallow their words. He had no idea where anyone was, or if they had survived the creature's attack. His lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep going, his feet pounding the forest floor in a frantic rhythm. The Wendigo was still behind him, moving with a horrifying grace, its long limbs carrying it effortlessly through the underbrush. The sound of its footsteps never wavered, never faltered. In the distance, Jake saw movement, two figures darting through the trees. It was Lisa and Eric, running side by side, their faces pale with fear. Relief flooded through him at the sight of his friends, but the terror of the moment was far from over. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through Jake's chest and made his blood run cold. He pushed himself harder, closing the gap between him and the others. They had to keep moving. There was no fighting the Wendigo, no stopping it. The only hope they had was to outrun it, to put as much distance between themselves and the monster as possible. But as the forest stretched on, Jake couldn't shake the sinking feeling that it was already too late. The hunt had begun, and the Wendigo wasn't going to stop until it had taken them all. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the thick canopy overhead blocking out the moonlight, leaving only the faint beams of their headlamps to cut through the oppressive darkness. Jake's breath was ragged, each inhale burning in his chest as he fought to keep up with Lisa and Eric. The adrenaline that had fueled his sprint was beginning to wane, but the terror of the Wendigo's pursuit kept him moving. Behind them, the forest echoed with the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. The Wendigo was relentless, its pursuit unwavering, and every step closer felt like a tightening noose around their necks. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape, but the forest seemed to be working against them. The dense underbrush slowed their progress, while the creature moved through it as though it were part of the woods itself. Jake glanced back, the sight of the creature's faintly glowing eyes sending a fresh wave of panic through him. The Wendigo was closer now, its gaunt, twisted form just a few yards behind them. It moved with an unnatural speed, its limbs long and thin, its face a grotesque mockery of humanity. Lisa's voice cut through the air, sharp with fear, urging them to keep moving. But Jake knew they couldn't keep this pace for much longer. The Wendigo was faster, stronger, and the darkness of the woods gave it an advantage they couldn't match. He looked around frantically, searching for any possible escape. That's when he spotted it, a narrow ravine just ahead. The terrain dipped sharply, the sides steep and covered in thick foliage. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. If they could lose the creature in the ravine, maybe, just maybe, they could survive the night. Without hesitation, Jake shouted to Lisa and Eric, directing them toward the ravine. They didn't question him, their survival instincts overriding any doubt. Together, they veered off course, their legs aching as they sprinted toward the steep slope. The ground dropped suddenly beneath them, and the three of them slid down the slope, dirt and leaves flying as they tumbled to the bottom. Jake hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his side, but he scrambled to his feet as quickly as he could. Lisa and Eric were close behind, equally battered but alive. For a brief moment, everything was still. The sounds of the Wendigo's pursuit had stopped, and the only noise was the heavy breathing of the three survivors. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the ridge above, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. But the ridge remained silent, the darkness pressing down like a thick blanket. Maybe it had lost them. Maybe, for the first time, they had outsmarted the creature. Jake's relief was short-lived. From somewhere deep within the woods, the Wendigo let out a chilling, guttural scream, a sound that reverberated through the trees, shaking him to his core. The creature wasn't done. It was still hunting. And it was closer than they realized. The chilling scream of the Wendigo echoed through the forest, sending a shudder down Jake's spine. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stood at the bottom of the ravine, Lisa and Eric beside him, their faces pale with fear. The brief respite they had hoped for was gone, replaced by the all-too-real realization that the Wendigo was still hunting them. And it was close. Jake glanced around, his eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of the creature. The forest felt alive with tension, every rustle of the leaves making his heart race. There was no way they could outrun it again, not in their exhausted state. They needed to find a way to outsmart it, to hide, or they wouldn't make it through the night. Lisa pointed toward a cluster of fallen trees nearby, their thick trunks creating a makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, but it would give them cover, at least for a while. The three of them moved quickly, ducking down behind the trees, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air was thick with dread, the weight of the Wendigo's presence pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. The creature was relentless, driven by a hunger that seemed to go beyond mere survival. The stories he had heard about the Wendigo, the tales of its insatiable appetite, its ability to track its prey no matter where they went, played over and over in his head. But this wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, and they were living it. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The distant sounds of the Wendigo's pursuit had stopped, and for a moment, the only thing Jake could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. He exchanged a glance with Lisa and Eric, their eyes wide with fear, but none of them dared to speak. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw it. The Wendigo, moving through the trees just beyond their hiding spot, its gaunt figure barely visible in the dim light. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the hunt. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its long limbs seemed to glide effortlessly through the underbrush. Jake's breath hitched in his throat as the creature passed within a few feet of their hiding place. He held perfectly still, his body tense with fear. The Wendigo's hollow eyes scanned the forest, searching, but it didn't see them. Not yet. But then, without warning, Eric shifted slightly, the sound of his foot scraping against the dirt breaking the silence. The Wendigo's head snapped toward them, its eyes locking onto their position. Panic surged through Jake's veins as the creature let out a deafening screech and lunged forward, its skeletal hands reaching for them. There was no time to think. He grabbed a nearby branch, swinging it wildly at the creature, hoping to buy them even a few seconds. The branch connected with the Wendigo's arm, sending it stumbling back for a brief moment. Jake seized the opportunity, shouting for Lisa and Eric to run. They scrambled out of the hiding spot, their legs burning with exhaustion as they sprinted through the trees. Behind them, the Wendigo recovered, its guttural growl filling the air as it gave chase. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer as the creature gained on them. But Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the treeline, the vast expanse of the Great Lakes stretching out before them. They collapsed onto the shore, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. The Wendigo stopped at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes watching them from the darkness, but it didn't follow. It remained just out of reach, as if the boundary between the woods and the water held it at bay. For now, they were safe. But the Wendigo was still out there, waiting. The motel's darkest secret. The long road through the American Southwest stretched out endlessly before them, its barren landscape broken only by the occasional tumbleweed and the jagged silhouettes of distant mountains. Josh, Emily, Sarah, and Travis were exhausted from hours of driving, their camper van rumbling along the isolated highway. They had been searching for a place to stop for the night, but the desolation of the road offered little comfort. As the sun began to set, casting a blood-red hue across the horizon, they spotted a sign for a roadside motel, the Rusty Spur Cowboy Motel, promising a theme fitting for the region. It looked old and worn, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The wooden structure, complete with a faded sign featuring a cowboy's silhouette, stood like a relic of the past. It was exactly the kind of place they would have avoided under normal circumstances, but exhaustion and the emptiness of the road left them with no other choice. The parking lot was empty except for a few rusted cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. The motel itself seemed equally abandoned, but the dim glow of a neon vacancy sign suggested otherwise. Reluctantly, they parked the van and made their way to the reception area, the wind howling eerily through the desolate landscape. Inside, the place was just as old and dusty as it appeared from the outside. Cowboy-themed decorations lined the walls, old boots, horseshoes, and paintings of desert landscapes, but the air felt thick, oppressive. Behind the counter stood a gaunt man in a cowboy hat, his shadow casting an unnatural shape on the wall behind him. His voice was low and gravelly as he welcomed them, though his eyes never quite met theirs. Josh felt a chill run down his spine as they were handed their keys. The man's hand lingered just a little too long, his bony fingers cold to the touch. But they were too tired to question anything. They simply wanted a place to sleep. Their room was just as unsettling as the rest of the motel. The dim lighting barely illuminated the worn-out furniture and the faded cowboy paintings that adorned the walls. The beds creaked as they sat down, and a thick layer of dust clung to everything. There was something wrong with the place, but none of them wanted to admit it aloud. The uneasy silence between them said it all. As they settled in for the night, the feeling of being watched crept over them. Travis, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about the ghost cowboy that probably haunted the place. His laugh, however, died quickly when they all heard it, footsteps outside the room, slow and deliberate. The four of them froze, their eyes darting to the door. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside. Josh swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked slightly, as if someone, or something, was just on the other side, waiting. Then came the shadow, a dark, towering figure visible through the thin curtains of the window. It stood motionless, watching them. The room felt colder, the air thick with a malevolent presence. None of them dared move as the shadow shifted, elongating unnaturally, before disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The room plunged back into silence, but the terror had only just begun. The room remained silent, but the tension hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. No one dared speak, each of them listening intently for any sign of movement outside. The shadow that had loomed just beyond the curtain was gone, but the uneasy feeling of being watched persisted, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Josh's mind raced as he glanced at his friends. Emily sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah had pulled her knees up to her chest, her face pale and expressionless. Travis, usually the one to crack jokes or lighten the mood, was stone-faced, staring at the door as if willing it to stay shut. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before Josh finally stood up. His legs felt heavy, almost as if the room itself was pulling him down. He moved toward the door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. Something inside him told him not to open it, but curiosity and fear pushed him forward. As he cracked the door open, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it an eerie stillness. The motel lot was empty, as silent and abandoned as when they had first arrived. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the distant hum of the motel's neon sign flickering in the dark. There was no sign of the figure they had seen, no footsteps in the dirt, no lingering presence. But the air felt wrong. Heavy, as if something unseen was still lurking just out of view. Josh shut the door and turned to his friends, forcing a weak smile. He tried to reassure them that it was probably nothing, a trick of the light, maybe. But none of them believed it, not even him. They had all seen it, the shadow, the unnaturally tall figure watching them. And though it was gone, the dread it had left behind clung to them like a second skin. Later that night, as they tried to sleep, the room remained filled with a coldness that seeped into their bones. Every creak of the old motel building made them flinch, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the cowboy legend the man at the front desk had briefly mentioned when they checked in. Something about a spirit that haunted the motel, a shadow of the past that never quite left. Sleep, however, was impossible. At some point during the night, Travis, who had been dozing fitfully, jolted awake. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes wide with panic. He whispered that he had seen it again, the shadow standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. When he blinked, it was gone. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. They all felt it. The shadow was no longer outside, watching from a distance. It was inside, moving among them. Its presence was oppressive, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. None of them spoke as they huddled together, their hearts racing, each of them praying silently for the night to end. But deep down, they knew the spirit of the cowboy wasn't done with them yet. As dawn approached, the heavy darkness that had engulfed the room began to recede, but the oppressive presence remained. The rising sun cast weak rays of light through the curtains, but they brought no comfort to the group. Josh, Emily, Sarah, and Travis had barely slept, each haunted by the growing sense that something was terribly wrong with the motel. Josh was the first to speak that morning. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, as he suggested they leave immediately. No one argued. The terror of the night before hung over them like a shadow, and the thought of staying even a moment longer filled them with dread. As they hastily packed their bags, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the same malevolent energy they had felt all night. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the wind outside sent chills down their spines. They moved quickly, desperate to leave the cursed motel behind. But as they prepared to head for the door, the atmosphere shifted once again. The light that had seeped in through the curtains suddenly dimmed, as though a shadow had passed over the building. Sarah gasped, pointing to the window where the dark figure had appeared the night before. This time, the shadow was inside. The figure stood near the door, its outline sharp and distinct in the dim light. It was taller than any of them, its broad, dark hat casting a long shadow over its face, which remained hidden in darkness. The cowboy, or whatever spirit it was, didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them with a presence so strong it felt suffocating. Travis, trying to break the tension, stepped forward as if to confront the figure, but before he could speak, the shadow began to move. Slowly, it shifted toward them, its form stretching unnaturally, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air felt heavy, thick, like they were breathing through water. Emily's voice cracked as she urged them to leave, her eyes wide with fear. None of them needed further convincing. They bolted for the door, but as Josh reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door, which had opened so easily before, now felt like it was sealed shut, trapping them inside with the shadow. The figure moved closer, its elongated limbs seeming to drift through the air rather than walk. The room darkened further, the light from the windows barely penetrating the thick shadow that now surrounded them. The ghostly cowboy seemed to fill the entire space, its presence pressing down on them like a weight. In their panic, Sarah began pounding on the door, desperate to get out. Travis and Emily joined her, their hands trembling as they pulled and pushed against the stubborn door. But it was as if the motel itself had become a prison, sealing them inside with the spirit. Just when it seemed as though the shadow would engulf them completely, the air shifted once more. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and with a loud creak, the door finally gave way. Without hesitation, they fled into the morning light, their hearts racing as they stumbled into the parking lot. They didn't stop running until they reached the van. The motel stood behind them, its windows dark and empty, but the shadow of the cowboy still lingered in their minds. As they drove away, the feeling of being watched never left them, and they knew the spirit wasn't bound to the motel. It had followed them into the light. The van sped down the empty highway, the landscape rushing by in a blur, but the tension inside the vehicle was suffocating. No one spoke as they drove, the fear of what had happened still clinging to them like a shadow. The motel, now a distant memory, felt too close for comfort, as though the spirit that haunted it could reach out and pull them back at any moment. Josh gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he kept his eyes focused on the road ahead. Emily sat beside him, her gaze distant, while Sarah and Travis huddled together in the back, their faces pale and drawn. The sense of dread that had filled the motel followed them like a dark cloud, heavy and inescapable. Hours passed, and the barren desert landscape gave way to the familiar sights of small towns and open fields. But even as they left the desolate wilderness behind, the feeling of being watched never left them. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light in the corner of their vision sent a jolt of fear through their hearts. The cowboy, or whatever spirit it had been, was still with them. Josh's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a split second, he thought he saw it, the dark figure standing at the edge of the road, its tall, shadowy form watching them disappear into the distance. His breath caught in his throat, but when he looked again, it was gone. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew the truth. The spirit wasn't bound to the motel. Hours later, as the sun began to set once more, casting long shadows over the road, Josh made the decision to pull over. They needed to stop, to rest, and to gather their thoughts. The small town they found themselves in was quiet, almost too quiet, but it felt safer than the open road. They checked into a simple roadside inn, far from the eerie cowboy theme of the Rusty Spur. That night, as they settled into their new room, the tension seemed to ease slightly. The motel was clean and modern, the kind of place where they should have felt safe. but the unease lingered, a reminder that the events of the previous night weren't just a bad dream. As the group tried to sleep, the silence was broken by a faint noise. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. But then it grew louder, a slow, deliberate creaking sound, like footsteps on old wooden floorboards. Josh sat up in bed, his heart racing as the sound grew closer. He turned toward the window, and there, just outside, was the figure. The cowboy, its shadowy form standing still in the moonlight, watching them once again. Its presence was as overwhelming as before, the air thick with its oppressive energy. He nudged the others awake, their faces filling with terror as they too saw the figure. The ghostly cowboy was not bound to any place. It had chosen them. The realization hit them all at once: no matter where they went, the spirit would follow. They had crossed paths with something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and now, it was attached to them. In a desperate bid to escape, they grabbed their belongings and fled the inn, driving into the night with no clear destination. But as they drove, the dark figure of the cowboy appeared once again on the side of the road, a constant reminder that they could never truly escape the spirit's grasp. The stories you just watched were filled with suspense and mystery. From the terrifying Wendigo attack deep in the Great Lakes forest, where only two friends barely escaped, to the haunting cowboy spirit that followed travelers at the eerie Rusty Spur Motel, fear lingered in every scene. And who can forget the ghostly figure watching the campers in the desert, or the chilling presence that seemed to follow our characters, even when they thought they were safe? Which story gripped you the most? Was it the moment the Wendigo appeared out of nowhere, or when the cowboy's shadow seemed to stalk them wherever they went? What would you have done in their shoes? Have you ever experienced something bizarre like this? Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed these stories, our channel, Deep, has plenty more chilling videos for you to explore. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on new content. And let us know in the comments which part you found the most terrifying. We'll see you in the next video, if you dare to return.